So here we are in week 2 of this series called Caves. And last week I told you about David's cave and how after he was anointed to be the next king, he faced so many different things that were trying to prevent him from reaching that goal. It would be years and years before he would be anointed king. And during a period of years where he was being chased by the king, by Saul, he was chased into a cave, and Saul came in to relieve himself. The King James says he covered his feet. But we know the story there. David had an opportunity. He was driven into the cave by dishonor. He was driven into the cave by lies, by Saul believing things falsely about him, and by Saul just really spreading that David was trying to kill him. And David had the opportunity. In fact, his men encouraged him to. But he did not dishonor the way he was dishonored. He showed honor and spared the king's life in front of his men and in front of Saul's men. And he was driven into the cave by dishonor, but it was honor that propelled him out of the cave and eventually onto the throne. We also saw how we must refuse to allow someone else's unrighteousness establish the level of righteousness by which we live. You can't let somebody else talk you into compromising your standard of righteousness. You have it set. I will not change. I will not compromise on any of this. And that was where David was. He was not going to kill the king. And even though it would have been the perfect opportunity for him to do so, and he was completely justified in man's eyes to do it, it was not what God willed. So David did not compromise, even though those around him, his closest confidants, encouraged him to do so. And that was the example for us. We don't compromise, even if it's something that our closest friends or allies would tell us, just compromise on this one thing. We don't let someone else's unrighteousness affect our standard of righteousness. And then we saw in Psalm 57, when David was in the cave, he wrote these words, verses 7 and 8, "My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and give praise. Awake, my glory. Awake, lute and harp. I will awaken the dawn." It's our praise that breaks through the darkness. When you're in the cave, when you're surrounded by evil and wickedness, you can praise your way through. And what happens is the light, the dawn, breaks through and shines on us. And it really, His presence, it fills us, and it gives us a place for His praise to inhabit. So for His presence to inhabit. Our praise is somewhere where His presence inhabits. Well, this week we're going to look at Elijah's cave. This week we're going to be in the cave with the prophet named Elijah, who is this gruff prophet who has these emotional swings back and forth. He experiences highs and lows, and one minute he's the bold prophet that proclaims the word of the Lord, that goes out there and calls fire down from heaven, and it does so, and he ends up slaughtering all these people we're going to talk about in a minute, these 450 prophets of Baal. And then another minute he's not as confident. He's insecure. He's crying out, "Woe is me!" And he's all in his feels, and he's just this emotional mess. And you know, I much as I don't like to admit it, I feel that. I get that. Because there's times when I feel bold and where I feel empowered and I feel like, you know, this is right exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And there's times when I feel like Elijah and I'm like, "Oh, God, why did you call me to this? I'm the only one who understands." And so when I read the story of Elijah, I'm like, yeah, man, I get that dude. So at this point in the story, Israel is a divided nation. It has the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, the southern kingdom, which is called Judah, and Elijah is in the northern kingdom of Israel, and the people are being led at this point in their history by a wicked king and queen, Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel, they were so wicked that even today, thousands of years later, we know Ahab and Jezebel as wicked rulers, and even those that have little to no Bible knowledge, you can call someone a Jezebel, and they will understand that, at least on some level, that is an insult. It's not a compliment. So this couple, this king and queen, were so wicked that here we are thousands of years today, and their example is still one of wickedness. So Elijah goes up on Mount Carmel, and this is the first time we see his helpless woe is me speech. 1 Kings 18 and 22. And I'm going to bounce around. We're going to look at 18. We're going to glance back at 17. We're going to spend a lot of time in chapter 19. We're going to go all the way to the New Testament and a couple things there. I'm telling you all this because I'm going to take you on a trip today. I'm going to show you something that I find interesting. I hope you find it interesting, and that we will land back at what we're talking about. So 1 Kings 18:22, then Elijah said to the people, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Elijah, even I only, you really feel the drama in this. I am the last righteous ambassador, speaking your voice amidst the debauchery of the world. I mean, you could really feel him summoning this up. There's no one left but I. And I know there's so many people who fall into this line of thought. Everyone else is of the devil. Everybody in my life is of the devil. And I'm the only right one that's left. Everywhere I turn, people are tearing me down. Everywhere I turn, and there's nobody else who understands what I'm going through. But after that, of course, Elijah, he's on Mount Carmel, and he defeats these prophets of Baal, 450 of them. And this story is one of my favorite Old Testament stories. When I was a little kid, it's one of the first stories that I remember my grandfather telling me. And it was a very special moment for me because it was funny because he was telling me this story about Elijah making fun of Baal, making fun of the prophets of Baal, saying, oh, your God's not answering? Maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Years later, when my grandfather was dying over the last week of his life, I felt the Lord impress on me that I needed to tell him that story. And I didn't want to tell him that story because I knew that God was giving me the opportunity for closure and I wasn't ready to close it. And so I eventually went in and sat down next to his bed, and he was in and out of consciousness, and I said, Papa, I know you remember the story. I don't know if you remember me telling it to me, but I wanted to tell you this story. And I began to read that text and tell him the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. And shortly after that, it was like, believe it was the next morning, he ended up passing. And it was a special moment that the very first Bible story he told me is the very last Bible story that I was able to tell him. So this story resonates at a very deep place with me. Elijah's on Mount Carmel, and he proves that God proves himself strong. Not to get into all that because I don't have time today, but God shows up. He proves that he is God who answers by fire. And Elijah is empowered in that moment, and he slaughters all the prophets of Baal. 450 of them, he strikes them down. Now, before all this, in chapter 17, Elijah called on a drought. And now it was time for him to pray that the rain would return. So he goes up and he prays, and we've talked about that a number of times. He prays and prays until there's a cloud the size of a man's hand. Then he is empowered in that moment to run. And now when you're running down a mountain, you can gain some speed, but this is some supernatural speed. He runs and outruns the chariots. God is empowered him. So he has just seen God's fire come from heaven and consume the altar and all the sacrifice and all of the water. He has seen God answer his prayer by sending rain. He had been empowered by the Spirit to slaughter 450 false prophets, and now he's on the run. That's how chapter 18 closes. Chapter 19 opens with Jezebel really mad about what Elijah did, so she's threatening to kill him. And here's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. Elijah on the run. 1 Kings 19. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he rose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. So he was in Israel. He had done this. He heard that Jezebel had sent this word. She basically put a bounty on his head. And so now he's running. And why is he running away? If you're running away, you want to live. But he's running for his life. And so what does he do? He runs to the southern kingdom of Judah. He leaves Israel, runs into Judah, running for his life. Verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree and he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Now that doesn't make sense with what was happening in the verse before. Elijah says, God, just kill me. I can't live anymore. Take my life. Now, I'm going to share some in-between verses that don't show up in the text, and these come out of the RRV. Now, I know there's different versions of the Bible, but I don't think anybody has the RRV because that's the Rodney's Revised Version. This doesn't appear in the text, so I do not claim that this is Word of God. This is Word of Rodney. Verse 4.5. So verse 4, Elijah says, it's enough. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. And here's where, if I were God, I would call him out on his stuff here. I know you're lying. You ran away to save your life. The fact that you're here shows that you don't want to die. If you really wanted to die, Elijah, you would have stayed in Israel where there was a bounty on your head and Jezebel would have killed you. So don't give me this. You don't really want to die. You're being dramatic. You're being over the top here. This isn't what you really, really want. You're just tired. You're just hungry. Have a Snickers. You're not yourself when you're hungry. But God sees right through our drama. He sees right through our facade, and that's why he didn't have to actually write verse 4.5. And there will be a couple other half verses I'll give you throughout the day here. But Elijah goes on, and he lays under a tree, and God feeds him. And verse 5, he lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. Verse 7, and the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. That food, I don't know if it was limbus bread or what, but it sustained him for 40 days and nights until he got to Mount Horeb. Now, here's something that I'm going to unpack a little bit deeper later. Mount Horeb, from where he was not a 40-day journey. It was actually more like 3, maybe 4 days journey if he'd have gone straight there. But he's running for his life, and he's in a familiar land, but he's not in the kingdom where Jezebel was. So it took him 40 days, but he got to this place called the mountain of God. Let's say that together. Say the mountain of God. The mountain of God. It's very significant. And I'm going to reveal why in just a second, but we can just write it on a pen, write it on a note, stick it right here. It says the mountain of God. I'm going to come back and grab that in just a minute. Verse 9. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Let's go back to the RRV, the Rodney Revised Version, and insert some things here. What are you doing here, Elijah? I can just see Elijah going, why are you asking me? I'm here because you sent me here. What do you mean, what am I doing here? And it's a great example here that when God asks us questions, it's not because he doesn't know the answer. When God's asking you a question, he's not sitting up there going, man, I really wish I knew what they were thinking right now. Man, I really wish I knew the answer to that issue. God already knows the answer to every issue. He's not asking because he needs your help. He's asking because he wants us to see something. He's revealing something within us. And Elijah goes back into his dramatic mood. He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. Right in the middle of this woe is me, in the middle of this drama, an angel had given him this food that was so sustaining that it lasted him 40 days. Nourished him for that long. Now, when we look back at last week, we see David's cave was a cave of dishonor. He was driven into it by dishonor, and he was catapulted out of it to the throne by showing honor. Elijah's cave is more of a cave of attitude. See, no matter what God had done to help him, and there was all of this all along the way, Elijah is acting like he's still doomed. Verse 11, he said, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. So God is telling Elijah, it's time for you to get out of this cave. It's time for you to come out of this attitude. It's time for you to get up out of what you're sitting in and go stand, because I'm about to show you something that's amazing. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. Why wasn't God in the big events? Elijah is a big event prophet. Elijah called down fire from heaven. Big event, massive, proving himself here, God showing himself strong. God did these crazy things in these big events. But when God wanted Elijah to know, he was showing him here, I'm not always in those events. Sometimes you just need to stop and listen. Sometimes I'm in a whisper. Yes, I'm God that can accomplish all of these things. Wind blowing so strong it peels mountain pieces off. Hurricane Charlie, 2004. I was in our church at the time was a shelter, and I remember looking in, I was in a portion of the building where I could see out, and I saw this brick building that was probably 100 years old, and I saw the wind blowing so hard, it was peeling the bricks off the side of this wall, and it amazed me. And when I think of this event, that it reminds me of this here, that God was so powerful that the wind began to peel a mountain, just peel chunks of it off. He would shake the ground, but he's not in that. There's fire, but he's not in that. But he spoke in the still small voice. Verse 13, and when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Again, the second time, what are you doing here? And Elijah, again, answers the same way. He's still got this woe is me attitude. I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your commandment. They've thrown down your altars. They've killed your prophets with the sword. And only I am left. And they seek my life to take it away. And so God gives him some instructions again. And basically he's telling him, go back. All right, you've come here. I brought you specifically to this mountain to show you something. Now it's time for you to go back. What was it that God said? What was it that he was whispering? Because all we know is that God was in the whisper and Elijah heard it. So let me put that up here with the holy mountain, the mountain of God, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The Lord said to him, verse 15, go return your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Wait a minute. That wasn't in Israel. Damascus is in Syria. So he's all the way down at Mount Horeb, and now God is sending him back north through the southern kingdom of Judah, through the northern kingdom of Israel, all the way to Syria to anoint a new king there. And verse 16, and Jehu, son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. Now, Jehu makes sense. He's going to be the next king of Israel. Okay, Ahab and Jezebel are wicked. I want you to go anoint this king to take their place. Well, let me tell you what God is communicating when you're in the cave of attitude. The cave says, I, even I only, am left. Only me. Nobody else knows what I'm going through. But God tells Elijah, well, here's what I want you to do. You got your little woe is me moment. I'm speaking to you in this wind. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go anoint a foreign king. I want you to go anoint the next king of Israel. And I want you to anoint your replacement. Oh, okay. God's telling him, I'm still God over all nations. And I still have a purpose for them. I'm still God over Israel, and I have a purpose for them. I'm still God over you, and I still have a purpose for you. I'm not done with any of you. And that resonates with me because we're in a world right now where everywhere we look, we see evil at work. We see unrighteousness everywhere. If you want to find evil somewhere, you look around, you'll find it. You can turn on the news, you can just drive around town, and you'll see something evil. And if I choose to, I can be overwhelmed by it. If I choose to, I can allow that to say, oh, look at all of this unrighteousness. God, I'm the only one who understands what's going on. I am the only one who knows how bad things really are. But God has everything in his hand, and he's telling you today it's time to get up out of that cave. It's time for you to come out of the cave. Because get this, you are anointed to be the change that the world needs. You have been anointed to be the change. There's too many people in this generation who you've been praying, you've been waiting. God sends somebody. God sends someone to do this, to help us here. God sends someone into the White House. God sends someone into the governor's mansion. God sends someone to do this. And the whole time he's saying, I have sent someone. I've sent you. You are the one to be the change that the world needs. Don't keep passing it on. You're not telling the stories to the next generation. You're not preparing them. And that's what we need to do. We need to be preparing the next generation of young people to come up. We need to be pouring into them. We need to be mentoring them. We need to look, the older generation that looks and says the younger generation is disrespectful, you need to be the example to them. Younger generation that looks to the older generation and says you're irrelevant, you need to be listening to them. And we need to be preparing them to be the change that God has made us to be, and stop waiting on somebody down the road to fix it. There's way too much, oh, they'll fix it. I'm just praying for God to send somebody. God, send someone, send someone. I did. I sent you. God's not done with this world. God's not done with this nation. God's not done with you. Verse 18. I love this here. This is again, if I were writing it, I would have been a little bit more in your face about it, but it's cool that God does it this way. Verse 18, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Let me rewrite that version in the RRV. Hey, Elijah, you ain't the only one, and you never have been. There are 7,000 people in Israel who have never bowed. And you weren't looking very far, because there are 7,000 of them. So God sends Elijah back down off the mountain to anoint Elisha. And I'm going to go through this. It's really just to set up where we're headed, not to dig too deep into this part. But verse 19, so he departed from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed him and cast his cloak upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, let me kiss my father and mother, and then I'll follow you. And he said, go back, for what have I done to you? God told him to go anoint his replacement. Go and anoint this person who's going to continue his legacy. And he lays his cloak on Elisha, and he walks on. Elisha just wants to tell his family goodbye, and Elijah says, I don't care what you do. What's all that? He's still grumpy. He's still grumpy. He's now doing what God told him to do, and he's still I don't care what you do. Oh, I'm just doing what God told me. Look here, you do what you're going to do. It's encouraging for me, and I hope that it is for some of you, that God will still use someone even when they're grumpy. So in this story, I told you, let me take this pen out now, and we're going to take all of this information and put it back in here. The mountain of God. What's special about that mountain, Mount Horeb? Some of you might know, Mount Horeb is also known by another name. It's used in different books of the Bible. It's called Mount Horeb. In fact, in certain, it's called by this other name that it's more popular or more recognizable name, Mount Sinai. Mount Horeb is Mount Sinai, and it's called the mountain of God. And 1,000 years prior to Elijah going to that mountain, Moses encountered God. This is the mountain where Moses would encounter the burning bush and would first hear the voice of God. This is the mountain where Moses would be tucked up into the cleft of the rock, and God would reveal his glory as he walked by. This is the mountain where God would speak to Moses and would deliver the 10 Commandments, the place where God gave his instructions to man about his plan to redeem mankind. It's at that mountain where God's purpose is given to Moses, and it's that same place that God would take and speak to Elijah. Now, let's go to the New Testament because I want to show you something really cool. This, whether or not all of this has no bearing. This is not a pillar of the church that if you shift this pillar of this theology, it will shake anything. So I'm showing you this, and I'm showing you this and prefacing it with this is a theory that is backed by certain biblical scholars. 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse 16. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. This is Peter. This is the disciple that had a tendency to stick his foot in his mouth, but there were other times, a lot like Elijah. He was really, really bold, and other times he messed up really, really bad. But here's, when he's writing this letter, he says, all of this that's coming, all of this about Jesus, all of this talking about the majesty, it isn't something I heard about. I was an eyewitness to his majesty. Verse 17, for when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. He heard the voice of God. He saw it, and he heard it. We ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain. Now, Mount Horeb is called the mountain of God. And Peter is referring to an event that takes place on somewhere called the Holy Mountain. Stick with me. I'm going to dig pretty deep, but I'm going to wrap it all together here in just a second. Verse 19, we have a prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you will do well to pay attention, as to a lamp shining in a dark place. Elijah, lampstand, there's some connection there as well. Until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. Now, what event is Peter talking about? Let's look in the book of Matthew. Matthew's story, he talks about this in chapter 17. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Now, all of that, there are biblical scholars who believe that the holy mountain mentioned here was Mount Horeb. Verse 1, it says 6 days. It is a 3 to 4 day journey, depending on where they were, from central Israel all the way down to Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. That is how long it would take for them to get there. That's enough time for them to make it on foot. This mountain, where Moses encountered the burning bush, where he was given the 10 Commandments, where Elijah encountered that still small voice. We're at this holy mountain, and Moses and Elijah are there. They appear, and they're talking to Jesus. Verse 4. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So here's what's happening. Jesus is pouring into these specific disciples. He takes them on this trip up this mountain that none of the others get to experience. They see Jesus transfigured. He's in his glory. They see Moses. They see Elijah. They're talking with Jesus. And what were they talking about? Well, I'll get to that. But what we see is this conversation happening, and Peter, wow, this is amazing. Let's build churches here. Booths, tabernacles, churches, altars, depending on which version you read, it's all the same thing. It's this, we need to build something here so that we will always know that this amazing thing happened. And Jesus is up there, he's talking, and Peter, he interrupts their conversation by saying this. They're having this conversation, and he's like, hey, Jesus, can we build a church here for you? Verse 5, and he, Peter, was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And Peter would reflect on this later on in 1 Peter when he said that. I saw this majesty. I heard this voice. It's not something I'm making up out of my own mind. And what happened while he was interrupting Jesus, God interrupted him, saying, hey, that's my son. Why don't you shut up and listen to him? Everyone else listens at that moment. You see, what Peter wanted to do wasn't a bad thing. Building those booths, those tabernacles, those churches, and honoring Elijah, honoring Moses, honoring Jesus, there's nothing wrong with that. But what it did was it took the focus off of the purpose. It took the focus off of the glorified Son of God. And in doing so, look, don't sacrifice the perfect for the good. Don't give up on what God's perfect will for you is because there's something good that you really want to do. Look, I really want to do this. This is good. This is good. And Jesus is over here and he's saying, but I've got better for you. I've got perfection for you. I've got this. Right, but this is so good, Jesus. You really need to see how good this is. And he's like, I'm Jesus. I was there when it was created. And like, yeah, but this is really cool. Don't miss out pursuing something good. Don't miss out perfect pursuing something good. So back to Elijah. As I mentioned before, when God called him to the mouth of the cave, he knew why Elijah was there. He knew what was going to happen in the future. And it could have been, and a little asterisk there, this is not in the text, but I'm telling you, this is what could have been happening here. Elijah is there sharing with Jesus and Moses, and it could have been that when he was speaking in the whisper, he was speaking to Elijah at the mouth of the cave. You see, God brought him and showed him the wind that would peel back the mountain. He showed him the earthquake that would shake the ground. He showed him the fire. That was Moses. That was the law. And then when he spoke in the still small voice, and Elijah heard him, that is the future. That is Jesus. God was revealing how he was in control of the past. He's in control today, and he'll be in control tomorrow. Look, I know that was my last series. I talked about past, present, and future. But somebody needs to be reminded of that today. We have moments in the cave when it's dark. We'll have moments where we feel alone, where we feel like nobody else understands my pain. Nobody else can know how bad it is. Oh, sure, they can see that there's problems, but nobody really knows what's going on in here. Nobody knows what's going on in here. They don't know how bad it is, God. And I am the only one who understands. But we cannot allow our feelings to dictate what happens next. Like I said, whether or not that mountain that Jesus took the disciples to was the same mountain, it's not, if it was or it wasn't, it's not going to change the sovereignty of God. It's not going to change the divinity of Jesus or the power of his blood. But by linking these three together in this moment, we can learn something. I learned from Moses what it means to be in the presence of God. Moses, who when he saw the burning bush, he took off his shoes because the ground on which he was standing was holy. He received the instruction from God. God told him to deliver his people, and we talked about it a few weeks ago. He said, who do I tell him sent me? And God said, tell him I am has sent you. That mountain where he goes and where the children of Israel end up making an idol out of a calf, out of gold. And God speaks to Moses and gives him the 10 Commandments. This mountain that we do know that it's the same mountain with Elijah. That Elijah was sent to, and God spoke this thundering word and led him and fed him and showed the wind, the fire, the earthquake, and the still small voice. So see, I learned from Moses what it means to be in God's presence. I learned from Elijah how to get over myself and how to listen for God in the quiet. How to listen for the still small voice. That, yeah, I like God in the big. I like the big mountaintop. In fact, it was so impactful for me that it was a story that stuck with me my entire life. And like I told you, I shared that with my grandfather on his deathbed because that was a connection between the two of us. Why? It was this big, boisterous, awesome thing. But God was speaking to Elijah, not in those big moments as much as he was speaking to him in the still small voice on that mountain. He wasn't in the earthquake, he wasn't in the fire, he wasn't in the wind, he was in the still small whisper. So I learned from Moses what it's like to be in God's presence. I learned from Elijah how to hush and listen for God in the quiet. And I learned from Peter that I need to focus on Jesus, not what's happening around me. Yeah, there may be some wonderful things that I'm seeing, but I learned from Peter not to sacrifice the perfect for the good. Focus on him. These caves are moments where we need to keep our mouths closed and we need to listen, filtering out other voices. David had to filter out the voices of his own men who told him to kill Saul. And he had to listen for the voice of God that had already told him what to do, that had already instructed him, and he would not strike down God's anointed. In Elijah's cave, he had to listen for the voice of God. He had to wait until the wind passed. He had to wait until the fire was gone. He had to wait until the earthquake was done so he could hear God in the still small voice. Because Elijah was looking at everything else that was going wrong in his life. He had this woe is me attitude because there was drought, there was famine, there were an evil king and queen, there was a bounty on his head, and everybody wanted him dead. Woe is me, nobody knows. Only I am alone, the righteous one. We can get distracted, same way Peter did, by looking at things around. But I want to remind you this morning that he is the God who takes all things and causes them to work together for his purposes. Will you stand? We'll see these things come to pass. Sometimes we may see God move in an earthquake, in a storm, in the wind, in a fire. But if we wait and we listen, that still small voice is what will guide us no matter what's happening around us. That still small voice that will lead us. Look, he said in Psalm, he said his word is a light unto our feet, a lamp unto our feet, and a light to our path. That means one step at a time. His word shows us the way. The next step, and the next step, and the next step. You want to be sustained? You want to have some food that will spiritually give you nourishment for 40 days? Get into his word every day. And what happens is it's enough to sustain you for the next day. And it's enough to sustain you for the next day. And you'll fall in love with the word all new. Every time you read past it, God will reveal something more new to you. And we will see all of these amazing things come to pass if we hang on and we trust God and we listen for his voice. Sometimes it might come in speaking to your spirit. It might come through his spirit as he quickens your heart and moves you to do something. Sometimes it may come, and many times it comes from just reading his word that he's already said. I've read that before. That's not for me. That's for Elijah. That's for Ahab and Jezebel. And you read it the next time and God says, hey, that's for you. This time it's for you. As I begin to pray this morning, this altar is open if you need to hear the voice of God. If you need to come down and pray. If you've never surrendered your life to Jesus, this is an opportunity. You can come down. You can cast your cares on him because he cares for you. You can come and pray. If you're overburdened with something, you can come lay that down at the altar at the feet of Jesus. No matter what it is, he's here and he's speaking to you. Maybe it's that you just need some filters over your ears and you've been listening to the wrong people. Maybe it's like David's men. They're good, well-intentioned, but you've been listening to them. Maybe it's like Peter and, okay, this is good over here. Let's build these churches. Let's build this over here. Let's do this wonderful thing. And God is trying to speak to you in that moment. He's saying, that's my son. Why don't you hush and listen to what he's saying? As I begin to pray, you may come. Father.